Great. Hi, everyone. I think we're really excited to bring you this next panel, which focuses on AI. I don't think our session will be as exciting as Kevin's opening session was. He really set the bar high there, but we're going to do our best. So just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Jagoda Howie. I am a Senior Vice President on Citi's Trade and Working Capital Sales team. And I am excited to be here really to moderate this panel on a topic that I think is important regardless of which industry that you're in, but I think is especially relevant in banking. And that's how can we build a people-centric culture around AI adoption? And I think even more importantly than that, how can we develop business champions in the transaction banking industry to help make that adoption not just a top-down directive, but a shared journey? I think that we can all agree AI needs to be not a replacement for human judgment, but rather a tool that can enhance our work and processes. I know Kevin had shared the stat that over 50% of employees may be using generative AI in some of their daily work, but they're afraid to admit it, right? Whether it's they're afraid to admit it due to compliance reasons, or that they're afraid to admit it that they're going to be replaced by that technology. So I think this panel is really important in figuring out a way, how can we use this technology to make us more efficient and allow us to focus on higher value work, which I think is something we can all get behind. The less time we have to spend writing emails or logging call reports, the more time that we can be spending in front of clients and really building those important relationships. Luckily for us, we do have a highly experienced panel here today to help us figure out a structured and balanced approach on achieving this. So with that, I'll let the panelists introduce themselves before getting into our discussion. Ned, why don't I start with you?
Sure. Thank you so much, Jagoda. Ned Carroll. I run data and automation, which is our process automation as well as artificial intelligence at PNC. Glad to be here.
Bell?
I'm Bell Martiana. I'm CEO of Clios. Clios is a talent acquisition AI software company. And our focus is really on enabling the hiring of the best talent possible for typically large organizations we work with. I've also been involved in payments, so before in my prior career, so I see a lot of joint theories between what we were talking about and what we're going to be talking about today. So.
And then, of course, Alethia, I know you're with us virtually, so I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself as well.
Hi, good morning. I'm Alethia Baggett. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I'm the Chief Human Resources Officer at the American Bankers Association, and this topic is something that we touch on almost on a daily basis.
Great, thank you. So I think with that, we'll jump right into our discussion. And I will say that we did not use ChatGPT to write our questions. We actually got together for a prep session and put our heads together in terms of, what are the best questions to ask to make sure that we're covering off on the various types of perspectives we have. Of course, we have a banking perspective, we have more of an HR perspective, and then we have a great point of view from kind of a recruiting point of view with Bell on the panel. So Alethia, I will start with you just to give us a little bit of an HR perspective on the topic. Managing the integration and utilization of AI within your organization requires a strategic and thoughtful approach. What are the key things to consider when making decisions around AI adoption internally?
So first, I will acknowledge that we did not use ChatGPT for the answers either. So, and that banks and organizations have been using traditional AI for years, credit scoring, fraud detection, process automation, risk assessment, just to name a few. So for us, it was really the democratization of AI that really created this new playing field and created a greater opportunity of risk. So not knowing who is putting what into these systems and tools or what is being done with the outputs, which might not be accurate. So at the highest level, the key things to consider and that we were looking at when going through this journey was governance, education, training, change management, and risk management and mitigation. So when we started having the conversation around AI implementation, we asked ourselves, who are the key stakeholders? And from that, we created a steering committee. And then our main areas of focus to consider were human capital, impacts, technology, change management, and risk to the organization. And for some organizations, this means different things. So for example, in a heavily regulated environment, that's a compliance component that a lot of other organizations don't have. So there's a lot more freedom in how you use the technology. So just being aware of that, which I know everyone in this room is. So once we had that steering committee in place, we really tried to identify what are we trying to manage, solve, or enhance, with risk being a big component of that, and ultimately what was our objective. So we really recommend focusing on low risk, internal task specific or transactional processes where you can increase productivity, speed, or overall efficiency, but without a lot of potential damage to the organization if it doesn't go the way, excuse me, that you were hoping. So it was really about how can we capture value now? So what are our table stakes versus creating value, which was our sort of long-term goal. So I heard it mentioned earlier, for a lot of organizations, there is a fear that this is going to eliminate some parts, if not all, of your job. I think it is a long time before that ever happens, if at all, because there's always a human element required. But we wanted to make sure that we tried to turn this dialogue into a positive and not a fear by asking, how can AI help you do your job better? Not eliminate it, but just improve it, excuse me, and get rid of some of those redundancies that are really taking up your time that could be used elsewhere. So the challenges in any approach that I think most organizations have is with lack of expertise on the technology, quality of the output, and the data privacy risk. So that's why I think it's really important that you get people used to the technology before you just put it into your organization. And this is where I think good governance, education, and training really come into place. The governance should provide guidance, and I think a common approach and language, but also give enough space for staff to learn from what they're doing and be innovative and creative with ideas on how to leverage the technology. So that can be a fine balance because that does lead to risk around unchecked outputs or intellectual property and data being put into a system that is now, out in the ether. The other thing to consider is the implementation of any technology should be scaled and at a pace that the staff can embrace, focusing on, again, the positive, encouraging a culture of learning, acknowledging that the human time cycle of learning is not days and weeks, but months and years, and that this isn't something that's going to happen overnight. You want to ensure that the technology is not just being used, but it's being used well and to the best interest of the work that needs to be done in the organization. Lastly, in terms of risk mitigation, you want control over what tools are actually being used in your organization and the information that's being put into them. So this again goes back to governance, education, and accountability on part of the employees. And as we require training. One way we address this was requiring training for all of our employees, but also providing an attestation on the policy. So they have an accountability to knowing what our requirements are and our governance, and then how to use it. So we provided a list and training on all approved tools, but also an avenue to request the use of a new tool. So we know that new tools are being developed regularly. A job might have a business case to require a new tool. So we gave them that avenue to do that. And then once a tool is reviewed, and if it's approved, it would get added to that list and made available to all staff with training. So I believe focusing on strong governance that aligns with your culture, educating and training your staff, and putting in the right level of risk management, again, that aligns with your culture, will enable a smooth integration and effective adoption of AI.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I want to pick up on something you kind of said earlier in your response of just understanding and keeping in mind who the key stakeholders are when you're rolling out these types of, policies or additional components of things that you may be doing from an AI perspective, is really just maintaining that, keeping the human at kind of, the forefront of whatever is rolled out. I know it was said earlier that banks, ultimately, we all kind of do the same thing, but we do it differently. So I think that's kind of where we can point to is, sure, there are dozens of tasks that can be automated through AI, but there's always going to be that kind of human element of what we do in transaction banking that, hopefully in our lifetimes is not going to be replaced by AI. Maybe just, Ned, from a banking point of view, to bring you into the conversation, what are the key things to consider when thinking through how to adopt AI?
So thank you. I love that 50% stat. It's like this, we used to talk about shadow IT, now we talk about shadow AI, right? So we're kidding ourselves to think that Gen AI isn't being used in the workplace. The St. Louis Fed did a survey. 38% of all Americans aged 18 to 62 use Gen AI. 29% of them, 29% of them use it in the workplace. 11% of them use it every day in the workplace. The Census Bureau did a survey where 5% of companies are using Gen AI. So I got a disconnect between 29% of Americans aged 18 to 62 and 5% of companies. We look at it really through three lenses, if you will. One is data. AI absent, organized, curated data is a shiny ball. And a lot of people are chasing the shiny ball. Data management is a human behavior problem statement. How do I drive human behavior around capturing accurate data? How do I drive human behavior around the application engineers that move and aggregate data? And how do I drive human behavior around the analytic and modeling teams who consume data? Modelers in particular are really clever. They will figure out ways around guardrails. If you look at a graph of like data access in Hadoop, which is just a big data platform, you see a network of really ungoverned data movement and use patterns. So first and foremost, data management. Second, from a governance perspective, we really look at governance through 4 dimensions. And we're really focused on having a prudent, human-centric approach towards how we ensure that we're not over-indexed in any one of these 4 dimensions. So one is AI as an enabler. So yeah, we see tremendous opportunity in AI from a business perspective. It's around applying AI to the gold we all sit on in financial services, and that gold are financial and non-financial transactions. Customer events for a financial services organization like a bank is what social networks are to Facebook. You think Facebook doesn't spend an enormous amount of time around organizing and curating social networks? That's all they do. And then they exploit it. And their valuation is driven off of that. So clearly we see it as an enabler in terms of driving growth. We also see it as an enabler for efficiency. In particular, when you think about, if you look at the control environment in financial institutions since the credit crisis, it's been layer upon layer upon layer of controls. Since most of those were addressed in a reactionary force to some sort of regulatory finding, what have you, they weren't done particularly elegantly. So you got a lot of control processes at banks that are really PowerPoint and Excel driven. So where do we see AI as really an enabler to drive a lot of automation in controls? And automation is important because automation of controls enables us to scale our business at lower cost. So we think of it in terms of the economics of it. One thing that the industry needs to start considering, quite candidly, is the marginal cost of AI. right? So unlike other technology where marginal cost like payment systems ultimately goes to zero, marginal cost for AI goes up. Because the models get more complex, the compute is there's more of a compute demand. So you really got to think about the economics of, am I getting value for that query? Because that query might cost me a lot of money, right? So there's a changing economic paradigm around technology as it relates to AI. So that's one dimension. The second dimension is clearly we look at AI as a source of risk. So think about bias, think about hallucinations, and how do we leverage our risk framework that exists today? You know, as Alethia pointed out, AI is not new. So we have controls around our systems development. So how do those need to be enhanced because of AI? We have controls around third-party management. How do those need to be enhanced because of AI and different use of AI? So clearly a source of risk. We also look at it as a tool for adversaries. Does anybody have any teenage kids? Okay, so my daughter turned 21 last May. So I had her give me her fake IDs because I was curious. Okay? Now, I routinely lost my fake IDs because I'd be too drunk and a bouncer would take it because I would give them the wrong name, the wrong address, or the wrong birthday. I lost like 4, either through police or bouncers. Some in this city, by the way, because I grew up in Baltimore. My daughter's fake ID, her name, my daughter's fake IDs, her name, her address, her birthday, with the exception of the year. They're from China, and they're really good. I mean, really good. Like she actually had one at TSA, and they finally checked the date. Oh my God. Right? So we were going through the airport is when I first busted her for a fake ID, because she pulled the wrong one out, right? So, you know, AI is a source of risk. It's a tool for adversaries. Think about deep fakes. You know, and a lot of that is not just communicating and educating our employees, but also working with our clients. You know, you guys have heard the new phrase pig butchering. Like, pig butchering is this concept of I'm gonna wean a pig and I'm gonna bleed it a little and then I'm gonna butcher it. There's a supply chain of vendors who do this in Southeast Asia and Russia and China, right? They outsource different components of the process. It is a tool for adversaries. And the final dimension is it's a source of risk in and of itself. You know, if people inject and do certain prompts into models we've built and give an answer that we don't want. So that's a lot about education. And then the final way we think about AI is the people considerations, right? Now, there are people out there that think Gen AI is going to be as disruptive to the knowledge worker as the shift of manufacturing to lower cost countries was in the 80s. Now, you look at some of the cities. I grew up in Baltimore. I'm in Pittsburgh now, but I also live in North Carolina, right? Baltimore and Pittsburgh, they're still suffering from the effects of manufacturing jobs leaving this country. Now, what'll be interesting is Charlotte, which is a very much of a knowledge center workforce. It'll be interesting to look at the demographics and employment patterns in Charlotte, assuming I live for another 20 years or so, to see how they shift and how do they shift because of Gen AI. So that's on like one extreme end of the impact. But another way we think about talent around AI is in hiring talent and managing talent. The way I learned to be an engineer, both in college and in the workforce, is fundamentally different than the way a 25-year-old learns. So I have to be careful as I think about both acquiring talent and managing talent, that I don't let those unconscious bias. You guys know the meme, you know, the way my father walked up, you know, to school uphill in the snow, right? So I've got to make sure that I don't introduce those unconscious biases in terms of how I hire and how I manage AI talent. Not just AI talent, but engineering talent and analytic talent. They've learned a different way. They communicate a different way. So that's something that we need to consider in terms of our hiring practice. I know, it'd be fascinating to see how you guys think about that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, maybe we can shift to you, Belle, to kind of
Sure.
focus a little bit more on the recruiting side. I know you have kind of a great litany of experience. You've been a chief information officer for a software company, a director of applications development at a large global bank, and now you are the CEO of Kleos, which is an AI-driven talent acquisition company. So how has recruiting candidates for these types of institutions changed over the years? And then how has the candidate selection process also changed over the years?
Yeah, so in general, I think we've seen a huge shift to online, right? Online job advertising and then online search or sourcing, we call it, where passive candidates are actually contacted as opposed to people actually applying to a role first. And we're seeing more and more of that. And AI is actually enabling some of these movement. The other thing that in a way has also increased, which is a little bit contrary to what you would think, is that more and more jobs are filled through networking, even though they're online networking in many cases, but about 60% of people find their job through networks of networking. And that's a big number, considering that companies invest a lot of time and effort in posting jobs and potentially, hiring a recruiting agency to actually go and do a search, retain search services and things like that. And we enable a lot of those systems, as well as the application process and what we call stack ranking. But what are the biggest things that I think we could continue to invest and improve is the networking aspect, but with the knowledge that AI is also causing a lot of problems in that area, right? But you see the shift that even like in the past, I would say 5 years, lower level jobs weren't online as much as they are today. And today I work with companies that hire for big retailers like Walmart. They're all moving online, right? So it's almost gonna be 100% online hiring on their side. And a lot of it is remote work, or even remote interviewing. And so right now for instance, we're talking through Zoom, and that causes a lot of problems. Like we have companies doing deep fakes, for instance. Mm-hmm. There's AI bots that can emulate a person, right? And actually Zoom itself can actually run those tools through plugins, right? So I could actually fake the other side of Zoom. And you could even have interviews with people you think you're actually talking to, and they're not real. So there's a huge change going on. And I think we're feeling it more and more and more. And I'd like to think that, there's the good side of it, but there's also the warnings that we can't be blinded to. And so when you actually build AI systems and you build recruiting platforms like what we do, you have to keep in mind, privacy, security, avoiding deep fakes, avoiding common knowledge that is actually false, which is another problem with AI. There's one of the things with AI algorithms is they try to find what's most likely the answer to something. And the way they do that is they rank different sources, right? A lot of the times those are not the best sources to search. And so, for instance, during interviewing, you see this a lot. The person is actually looking at their screen and not really talking to the person because they're actually searching for the answer on ChatGPT, right? So what I tell hiring managers is, okay, you do the same thing before you give them the question. And if they look the same, then they cheated, right? And but the world is changing and you have to have those tools at your disposal, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a huge shift. I think we're gonna see, I can't even tell you what the future is gonna look like, but what I can tell you is that you can't be blinded to it, right? So you have to accept that it's changing. You have to also look at networking completely different than you used to in the past. Because I think that rather than depend on the traditional methods to hiring people, I think connections are gonna become more and more important. And we're talking about a human-centric, AI-driven world. And I think that's really important, especially in the area of decision making, right? I've been doing this for a long time in recruiting, and when we first built the AI model that we started with, most recruiters were afraid for their jobs when we gave it to them, because it was shocking to them that it could do a lot of what they did manually, like search the web for candidates, go into LinkedIn and find the best people that suited, contact them, did a lot of things for them. And most of them kind of refused to use it at a lot of companies. And so there was this shock factor. And it was a lot before AI was kind of commonplace in now everybody's heard of ChatGPT. In those days, we're talking about 8-9 years ago, it was a shock to recruiters that a tool could do a lot of this, and there was a bit of a pushback, right? And we came to the understanding that you really can't just give somebody a tool, you have to do training, and I think that's something that we talked about. You have to do training, and you have to ensure that the decision making is still in the human's hand, and it's really not taken away from you. And I think that's a big challenge, especially when you're doing mass hiring at some of these large retailers. They've tried to implement a lot of automation in decision making, and I think it's a bit of a dangerous line to walk. So that's some of the things that I see in the marketplace. Now, I do see, kind of like what Kevin was referring to earlier, I do see that automation is going to enable almost every job, right? And I say automation because a lot of people call it AI, but it's really just another tool to automate a lot of what you do. And I also think that the area that I would focus the most is in making informed decisions using AI. And what I mean by informed decisions, it's not typing in your question into a chatbot and getting an answer and that's all you read. It's actually checking the sources. So one of the things I did last night is I had written my answer to a lot of the questions that I knew you were going to ask me, and then I checked ChatGPT, right? Kind of what I told the hiring managers to do. So I checked it, and I noticed that it was very different, but there was a lot of good content that I could potentially use, but I looked at the sources below, right? Below everything, you usually see the sources of and I started clicking on those and reading the sources. And to be honest, there was two things that were shocking. One is that some of the things that the sources were saying were not exactly how ChatGPT had summarized it. They were a bit different. You could even interpret it differently. The other one was, one of the sources was a Wall Street Journal article. And when I clicked on it, I only could read like the top 3 or 4 lines because I wasn't signed into my Wall Street Journal account. So I couldn't really see it unless I had a Wall Street Journal account, but I was shocked that ChatGPT was able to read it, summarize it, and combine it into an article. And so there you go, there's an access problem there. I think the Wall Street Journal people have to check, because if ChatGPT can read all the articles and they want people to pay for a subscription, then, who's going to pay for the subscription? Right? I'll just ask ChatGPT to show me the summary, right? And so there's issues. There's issues now. I mean, it's really happening. I think Kevin alluded to this a little bit, is that sites have to be aware that AI is going to be searching their systems, and it's going to be extracting information. And what you give those AI search engines capabilities to search, right, it has to be restricted. You have to guard some of your data, right? Not just private data, but data that is potentially something that you're using to actually get human interaction, as opposed to, get extracted from your site and given to another system. So it's a very interesting time. I'm very excited to be part of it. But I think, as a software developer and as a technologist, I really believe that the training aspect to people has to be in a decision empowering way. So you have to give them the tools, you have to show them how to get to the sources of the tool and how to actually interpret what's right and what's wrong from what you're hearing, and not just take everything at face value, and make decisions that are informed, really informed, right? Not just sort of delegating that decision to an AI bot.
Yeah, I love what you said about checking the sources, right? I think that's so important. You can't just take the response that you're given through ChatGPT or any other kind of Gen AI tool and say, take it on its face, right? Like this has to be right because it's pulling from all these various different sources. It's what we all used to do when we used to write, research papers in school. You have to go through the sources, cite those sources, and then, of course, our teachers and professors would review those sources to make sure that we had kind of put it in our own words. So it's interesting to kind of the recommendation that you give to employers of when they're hiring candidates of do what you think that the candidate may be doing in terms of put the question into ChatGPT, see what the response is, and then it's almost like a little bit of a gotcha moment, but you can kind of tell which candidate is adding its own human element to the response versus just taking, what's in ChatGPT.
Yep.
I know I'm getting the yellow light. I think we have about 2 minutes left. So I want to just kind of do a little bit of a key takeaway from each of the panelists before we wrap. Alethia, maybe I'll start with you. Kind of, if you had one or two maybe recommendations, just how can organizations manage the fears and resistance to AI adoption that their employees may have?
Thanks, Jagoda. I really think it's making sure it all starts with governance, number one, but then educating them on how the tools can benefit them and making sure that the leadership in the organization is aligned around that. So it's taking that fear out and, flipping that on its head and saying, how can we make you more effective? How can we free up your time to do your job better? And really just removing the fear and then having the really strong governance to point to.
Thank you. Ned?
I think part of it is organizations being transparent. Gen AI will have an impact on the workforce, just like technology had an impact on the workforce. Just like a lot of things that get introduced and drive productivity in a company or in the economy have impact on the workforce. So I think first and foremost and some of that impact is very positive, and some of that impact for some will be viewed as negative. I think being transparent about that, being declarative around what your organizational strategy is, what your intent is, and how you're enabling employees to lean in to new technology. Again, banking has had the effect and impact of new technology, hit us in my entire career. It will continue to do so. So I think being honest and open about what that is.
Yeah, having more of these types of discussions. And Bell?
Yeah, I think from a hiring perspective, I think that we're in a world where a lot of the information now is very easy to get, right? And so when you used to have knowledge, people who were basically hired because of their knowledge, that in some ways is being leveled a little bit. Now, I see that as a bit of an opportunity, because if you look at the employment numbers and the unemployment numbers and the number of open positions, you almost could fit all those unemployed people into those open positions. And that's like an actual number. But they don't fit because they don't have the same skills that the employers are looking for. With AI, you could actually get them to those skills either quicker, or they may not need as many skills to actually be able to do it. So we need to start re-educating. I think education is a big key factor, but re-educating even the hiring managers who are looking for people on, what can the person do if I give them the right tools, even though they don't have all the skills that I'm looking for, right? And so I think that's a huge opportunity. We could have zero unemployment if we actually use those tools to really help the people who really need those jobs but can't achieve the outcome.
So governance, transparency, education. If you take three things away from today's panel, that's kind of, I think, the approach that we would recommend on building that people-centric culture around AI. So I know we're over time, and I think break is next. So thank you guys. Thank you to our panelists. And
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the session.
Thank you.